Anne of Cleves, was the fourth wife of King Henry VIII and Queen Consort of England from January 6th to July 9th of 1540. In history, she is most known as Henry's ugly wife. Ugly enough that he had the marriage annulled 6 months later. Is this fair? Should we really believe that her looks alone were so displeasing that Henry was willing to derail months of planning and diplomacy and earn further scorn from the major European households? Was it really her looks that derailed the marriage? I think, in order to prove or disprove such a claim, we need to go back and look at the key events that led up to their marriage. Anne was born on either the 22nd of September or the 28th of June in 1515. Born in Dusseldorf, Germany, as the second daughter of Johann III, also known as Johann the Peaceful, and the great patron of Erasmus. Not much is known about Anne's early life, though we know she wasn't given a formal education, but was skilled in needlework and enjoyed playing cards. She could read and write, but only in German. In 1527, she was betrothed to Francois, heir to the Duchy of Lorraine. She was only 11 years old, and Francois only 8. The marriage did not proceed, and was officially cancelled in 1535. Both were free to marry elsewhere. In 1538, only a year before the marriage negotiations with England began, Anne's father separated his lands and religion from papal authority. King Henry had famously done the same only 4 years earlier. This made Cleves an attractive ally for Henry and England. Because of the recently signed Treaty of Toledo, which excluded England from any further treaties with the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and the French King Francois I, Henry was now in need of a foreign marriage to strengthen the isolated England. Anne and her younger sister Amalia were both brought to Henry's attention by his chief administrator Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell reported that Anne's beauty surpassed that of Christina of Milan, a woman known for her beauty, and one that Henry already had his eyes on. Henry didn't trust Cromwell's hearsay evidence and had artist Hans Holbein the Younger dispatched to paint portraits of both Anne and Amalia. Henry insisted that both portraits be as accurate as possible and to not flatter either sister. Henry was so captivated by the portrait of Anne that on October 4th of that same year, he had a marriage treaty signed, allowing the marriage to proceed. It is said that Holbein's portrait is overly flattering or even actively deceptive. But why would Holbein defy his king and patron? If this is true, how would he have gone unpunished and maintained his life and work in England? If we consider that this was one of the inciting factors in Cromwell's undoing and eventual execution, do we really think that if Henry believed Holbein had an active role in this deception, he wouldn't have been punished, and at the very least lost his favor at court? Because of this, I think it's safe to say that Holbein's portrait of Anne is an accurate depiction of her. And let's be very clear, there is nothing unattractive about Anne in this portrait. Her round face is clear and her complexion is light. Her eyes are warm and compassionate. She isn't a jaw-dropping beauty, but there's nothing ugly about her. I can see why Henry would have been enraptured by this image. Anne and her soon-to-be husband, King Henry, met on New Year's Day of 1540. Before we continue to this ill-fated meeting, I need to fill you in on something about King Henry. Henry, since he was a young prince, was obsessed with the chivalric traditions of gallant knights. His favorite stories growing up were those of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. He loved the old traditions of disguising himself and masquerading as someone else. He frequently did this in his youth. He reveled in the throwing off of his mask and homespun clothes to the shock and delight of his fellow courtiers. At that time, Henry was considered to be the most handsome prince in Christendom. He was impressively tall, standing almost a head taller than everyone else, and his frame was lean and very athletic. The Henry of 1540, through aging and ill health, was quite fat. His injured leg, which never fully healed due to an ulcer, had a defining smell. One of the main reasons this meeting seemed doomed from the start was that Henry was aware of it, but Anne was not. Anne was on progress from Dover, and thought that Rochester, the place of their surprised meeting, was only a stop in her journey. The jubilant king, in full disguise, raced up to Anne's room, walked straight up to her, and kissed her. Anne was horrified, and more than likely a bit disgusted. She was the soon-to-be Queen of England, and a fat, lowly peasant was permitted into her chambers and allowed to kiss her. Also, Anne was German, not English. She was not familiar with the courtly love traditions that Henry enjoyed. Even if Henry had arrived in full kingly garb, who's to say she would have acted any differently? Henry was embarrassed by Anne's revulsion and became enraged. It's reported that the king burst from the room and said to the waiting Cromwell, quote, "I like her not. I like her not." For the vain king, there was no coming back from this. With his shattered pride, Henry claimed that he was disappointed with Anne because she was not as described. What the portrait might not have shown was Anne's height. Henry's previous wives were all of small stature, whereas Anne might have been surprisingly tall or big-boned. This could have possibly been enough to turn the king off for good. Henry urged Cromwell to call off the union, but nothing could be done without damaging the vital alliance with Germany. Henry was trapped, and his frustrations fell solely on Cromwell. It was the beginning of the end for his chief administrator. On the 6th of January, 1540, King Henry and Anne were married. Their wedding night did not go as planned, and their marriage remained unconsummated. Henry confided in Cromwell, saying, quote, "I like her before not well, but now I like her much worse. I have left her as good a maid as I found her." He also claimed she had, quote, "very evil smells about her, and that she couldn't be a virgin because of the, quote, looseness of her belly and breasts and other tokens." Strong words from a 50-year-old man with a festering leg. And Anne was most definitely a virgin when she wed. In conversation with the Countess of Rutland, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, she said, "When the king comes to bed, he kisses me, and taketh me by the hand, and biddeth me good night, sweetheart. And in the morning he kisses me, and biddeth me farewell, darling. Is that not enough?" Anne wasn't even aware that more needed to be done to make the greatly anticipated Duke of York. She thought that Henry simply sleeping beside her would eventually impregnate her. I think it's kind of sad that we commentators sit here trying to determine if a young woman's body was attractive enough to inspire lust in an old man. I don't think Anne's physical appearance had anything to do with her unconsummated marriage. Henry's fragile masculinity was hurt the day they met, and he needed to spin a story that would get him out of the marriage. Henry was very aware that a marriage was not valid until consummated. If he had fulfilled his duties as a husband, it would have made it a lot harder to divorce her. If he claims that she is too ugly to bed, then no children can come from this union, and that is grounds for annulment. Also, by the spring of 1540, Henry already had his eyes on one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, Catherine Howard. This would have only quickened Henry's need to be rid of Anne. On June 24th, 1540, Anne was commanded to leave court, She was sent to Richmond Palace and ordered to remain there. She was informed on July 9th of 1540 that her marriage to Henry was declared illegal on the grounds of non-consummation and her pre-contract with Francois of Lorraine. 3 days later, it was officially annulled. Not even a month later, on the 28th of July, Henry married his fifth wife, Catherine Howard. On that same day, his longtime advisor and confidant, Thomas Cromwell, was executed on Tower Hill. Anne consented to the annulment and received a generous settlement. She was given a pension and many fine houses, including Richmond Palace and Hever Castle, birthplace of Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife. Pleased by Anne's compliance, Henry named her as an honorary member of the king's family, and referred to her as his beloved sister. She was given precedence over all women in England, except Henry's wife and daughters. Anne was welcomed back to court and spent time with Henry and his new bride. It seemed Henry had finally found a compliant woman in Anne, who would do as she was told. The same couldn't be said about Catherine Howard. Anne is known to be one of the great survivors of Henry's many nuptials. She lived out the rest of her life in comfort and security. She outlived Henry, who died in 1547 at the age of 56. Anne saw the coronation of Henry's two children, Edward VI and Mary I. She held a place of honor at court until 1557, when her health began to wane. Mary I allowed her to live at Chelsea Old Manor. It was here she wrote her last will, that included her brother, sister, and future Queen Elizabeth. She also left a generous amount to her servants and asked for their continued employment in Elizabeth's household. Anne died on July 16, 1557, at the age of 41, with cancer being the most likely cause of death. She was buried in Westminster Abbey on the 3rd of August, her epitaph reading, Queen of England. I think Anne was a remarkable woman of her time, and I believe she would have made a just queen. Even though Henry was probably the most undesirable man in all of England, I think he and Anne could have had a happy marriage, if his gigantic ego hadn't spoiled it. And I think Henry realized this later in life. Why else would Anne be given a pension and a continued place at his court? Why would a woman who caused him so much embarrassment be given anything? Anne had many commendable features. She was kind, easygoing, and obedient. And on top of that, good looking. This is why Henry kept her around. Henry had never in his life been rejected the way Anne had initially rejected him. And I think in those few months between marriage and divorce, Henry wanted nothing to do with her. He couldn't get past their first meeting, and he wanted out. So he didn't consummate the marriage. And if he blamed Anne's physical appearance, then he would have grounds to divorce her. I also think Henry's relationship with Catherine Howard played a big part in his eagerness to annul the marriage, because he had another, much younger queen ready to take her place. I do think it's possible that Henry wasn't completely pleased with Anne's appearance, meaning that she was possibly a lot taller than he expected, or that her features were more defined. I'd like to add that Henry weighed close to 400 pounds when he died. This was only 7 years before his death, so his weight couldn't have been far off. Let's just say, I think there were 2 people in that room that were not satisfied with what they saw. And I think we need to stop debating about Anne's attractiveness and look at the type of man that Henry was. A bitter old king at the end of his life that wouldn't be told what to do, and was content to hop to his next wife without considering whose name he might be damaging. Anne is kind of remembered as the sad, rejected wife of Henry. It's almost as if people pity her, because she was unwanted and quickly replaced. But being unwanted by Henry seems to be a much safer route. And she came out physically unscathed on the other side. Something that can't be said for most of Henry's wives.